Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Marcia, and all the organizers. It's great to be here. We are a trio working on this virtual reality project, or Cyberworlds project, called World Music in Wonderland. And I thought I would start just by running through a few of the issues and the broader significance of these things for ethnomusicology, curating music, and so on. What does curating and exhibiting sound really entail? And I started thinking about this, and I realized there's sort of a process you can run through. There's a process of disembedding sonic materials, which could be thought of as sort of being extracted from a continuum of the social, cultural, and psychic. And by the way, I want to think about exhibiting sound in a very broad sense. And hopefully some of you come to Edmonton next fall, this will be part 2 of this. We're going to be looking at exhibiting sound from the perspective of electroacoustic music, from the perspective of science, from all perspectives, so sound in the general sense, not just humanities and social science. So how do you extract sonic material from this sort of continuous environment? And then out of that, somehow or other, objectify sonic objects. You have to create these, and they're constructs in a way. Then to select a subset of those objects that maybe represent a larger space. The construction of new environments, and then embedding those objects in those new environments, somehow without disrupting things too radically. Or maybe you want to disrupt them, but at any rate you have to be aware of these issues. And finally, enabling communication within the new social space defined by those new environments. So you could think about maybe a museum in which sound plays a role, or an art gallery, or possibly a website. So what are some of the potential problems here? Well, in the original continuum, the observer, the listener, the perceiver is an integral part of the environment. But when you start to disembed, this is a term also used by Anthony Giddens, and I'm trying to sort of work through these theoretical ideas of what happens when you move things from their original place to a new place. Well, possibly you get a weakened psychic engagement because there's a sort of a reduction in the sensory links to the material. You're no longer really in it. I mean, imagine going through a museum and, say, pushing buttons to listen to sound. There may also be distortions entailed by disembedding and re-embedding these objects and the process of objectification. In many settings, there's also a sort of a desocialized environment of interactions. In other words, in a museum or an art gallery, you have to be somewhat quiet and people couldn't interact with each other so much. So even though it's a real social space, but possibly it's been desocialized. There's also a limited social range of communication. Now within that range, communication may be very rich. But you have enforced a kind of a synchrony in time, and that I'm sort of coining a word here, syntopy, to mean occupation of the same space. So it's confined to a common time and a common space, typically, at least in a real environment. So what are some of the advantages of a cyber world? When I thought about it, I identified 3 primary ones. And by the way, I don't mean to imply that the cyber world is a panacea or that it's a sort of a superior substitute for something else, but only that it may confer certain advantages and maybe supplement other modalities. So one is certainly that the environment is configurable. We could be representational of the original environment. That is, we could try to represent some street scene where sound was embedded, or it could represent the new environment. It could represent a museum or a map. Or it could be something totally creative. I mean, it's open, it's flexible. We can define the laws of physics, the way people interact, their patterns of communication, and so on. Secondly, cyberworlds ideally are immersive. And so this gives you back a measure of psychic engagement that you won't get, say, with a website. In the case of our system, it's not fully immersive. So we have what, and maybe Michael will talk more about this fish tank virtual reality, in which you're not immersed in it, as in these new wearable, what do you call those, like the Oculus?
HMD,
head-mounted displays. But you just see it on a screen. But the interesting thing about the system we're developing is that auditorially it is immersive. you get what's called spatial sound, and we'll hopefully be able to demonstrate for you all some of the effects of having this sort of left-right spatial localizations. Finally, you get to define a new social interactive space, a space of avatar users. You're all familiar with the avatar paradigm, probably from video games, if not from elsewhere. This sort of cyber sociality implies synchrony, but not syntopy. So we're synchronous, we're all inhabiting the space together, but we don't have to be in the same place. And so it defines a sort of a distant, independent sociability. Now there's other limitations, obviously limitations of language, limitations of time zone, and so on, but it is possible in theory anyway for people to come together in a new way. On the other hand, by separating the user from the avatar, we enable some other modalities that are not possible in real social life. For example, narrowcasting, directing your communications in particular directions and not in other directions, which Michael or Rasika both will talk about, and multi-presence, spawning new selves to inhabit various parts of this cyberspace. What are some of the applications here? It would be interesting to brainstorm if there were time with all of you. Some of the things we've thought about is, in terms of research, using the cyber world itself as a virtual laboratory for ethnomusicological research. We'll talk about this more on Thursday or Friday whenever we give our talk on Focus in Wonderland. Possibly using the cyber world to disseminate results to the general public or to a more specialist audience for research conferences and meetings, public lectures, and so on. This then verges on education. There are many applications that get enabled: discovery learning, peer or collaborative learning, distance learning, inverted classroom techniques work well with this, multi-user gaming-based learning, and obviously for a certain generation, this will remind of video games and therefore become immediately more appealing. And then outreach, connecting to people, connecting to communities in new ways. Again, there are limitations. There's the digital divide. There's frustrations or limitations with technology. But ideally, at any rate, it lets you reach out to a community that you might not otherwise reach due to the inability of everybody to come to some physical space. So having sort of framed some of the issues there, I wanted to introduce now my colleagues in computer science who have come to join us all the way from Aizu in Japan, Aizu Wakamatsu. Professor Michael Cohen, who's a professor of computer science at the University of Aizu and an expert in hypermedia, spatial sound. We'll also talk about narrowcasting and multi-presence and probably lots of other things. And then his doctoral student, Rasika Ranaweera, who is the principal programmer behind World Music in Wonderland. And hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate to all of you some of the features of this system, which is being deployed, first of all, in the portal that you saw earlier that Marcia demonstrated. And then in a different configuration when we speak on Thursday for Focus in Wonderland, which is actually a map-based virtual reality. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael. He's ready?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. We're pleased to be here. I used to live in Montreal, but I'm a U.S. citizen originally 25 years ago. Rasika's from Sri Lanka, and it's refreshing to enjoy Canadian hospitality. People here genuinely are, in some sense, nicer than south of the border. We're in actually Fukushima, about which you probably heard a few years ago. We're about 98 kilometers away from the nuclear power plant. So the radiation is not an issue, but our university is prefectural and took a hit publicity-wise from all the fallout. I compiled a list of my own Canadian content. These are the songs that I listen to. Maybe some of these are familiar if you're old like I am. Maybe. And the motivation was to imagine what it would be like to take the same kind of collection and enjoy it online. Yesterday, Rasika and I enjoyed touring around the area a little bit. We enjoyed in Baddeck is the Alexander Graham Bell ancestral home. Alexander Graham Bell is Scottish by birth, but he spent the last half of his life here. In fact, he died here, and he was very active in education for the deaf. And one of the speakers, maybe Ella, talked about that before. Deaf education? Yeah? Yeah. And he's famous in Japan. In fact, in Japan, March 3rd is known as National Hearing Day. Some of it is wordplay, because me in Japan means 3, and me, the 3rd of March, is homonym for the word for ear. But there's some other coincidences as well. It was March 3rd is the day that he was born, I think, and it's also the day that Annie Sullivan started teaching Helen Keller. So there's some resonances between hearing and Alexander Graham Bell and Cape Breton. All right, so who can tell me what the core of multimedia is? I'll give you a hint. My research is mostly about interactive experiences. That is to say, online, dynamic, real-time, control, and display. So the core of multimedia is time. So we're interested in things that interact, that are interactive in the sense that the display is synchronous more or less with the control. That when you change something, you can observe that change immediately. If you think about the evolution of user interfaces for computers, we're sort of in the 3rd generation of computers right now, of user interfaces. The first generation was basically one-dimensional, like a text string. You start at the top left, and you read to the bottom right, and it's 1D. It's what Calais called the violence of the lineal dimension. The second generation introduced a graphical or area-based interface where you had a mouse or a pointer and a cursor, and you could manipulate things on a 2-dimensional space by dragging icons around. And we're entering sort of the 3rd dimension of user interfaces that correspond to the 3rd generation, kind of a virtual reality paradigm, where even though the screen is still 2-dimensional, it's portraying 3-dimensional things. And in the same sense, a sound can be also stretched across those different dimensions. The 1-dimensional array of sound would be like what we have here, a linear flattening from a left-right spectrum. But you can imagine that sound also has a up-to-down heave and a front-to-back surge, as well as the lateral sway. So if you think of, in the top left corner, one-dimensional data stream as the simplest kind of data, like a text data, like my generation, I started out on so-called glass teletypes, where there was no GUI, there was no mouse, it was just text. And you add to that things like graphics and animation, and pictures and music and sound, you get multimedia. So that's moving vertically down the left side of this graph. And that's kind of orthogonal to another generalization of that one-dimensional data in the sense of adding nonlinearity to it. Again, rejecting the what Calais was talking about, the linear violence. So the user can choose their own path through a document by exploring hyperlinks. In traditional publishing, those would correspond to marginalia or footnotes or bibliographic citations, or what Ely mentioned about nonlinear interactive documentaries or films, or sometimes called machinima. Machinima being a composite word meaning machine cinema. So that spawns a hypertextual model for information. So when you cross hypermedia, hypertext with multimedia, you get hypermedia, in the sense that information now has a spatial attribute that can be explored or manipulated or visited. So hypermedia, in that sense, is sort of equivalent to virtual reality or cyberspace, in the sense that we have a natural interface that sets aside, old-fashioned interfaces like a keyboard or a mouse, and embraces a more three-dimensional kind of interface to the information. So the human here is in the middle of the computer-human interface paradigm, and the computer is kind of surrounding the human. So we anticipate a ubiquitous computing environment where the environment, the room, for instance, is saturated with control and display devices. Control devices are input devices, things like keyboards or a mouse or a microphone or a camera, and output devices are for display, things like a screen or speakers. So in the future, the near future, we'll be able to get away from kind of, fourth wall style presentations and envelop the audience or the user in a more modern kind of seamless interface. So the computer is controlled by the human, and then the information in the computer can control either real or virtual things. If it's controlling a real thing, it's like a robotic or a telepresence kind of paradigm. If it's controlling a virtual thing, it's like an online virtual community, like Second Life or something like that. And so that sigma right there is a mathematical notation, meaning adding together. So we can take sample data, like a photograph, and combine it with synthesized data, like computer graphics, and present that to the user through the display. So old-fashioned virtual reality had what Michael called a head-mounted display. It's a helmet that the user would put on, and it has stereo headphones and binocular displays in front of the eyes, and kind of simulate a virtual environment. There's head tracking, so the computer knows which way the user is facing and adjusts the auditory and visual displays to accommodate that virtual position. And there are different kinds of motion capture and user interface techniques for enabling that style of interface. In this sense, in this picture, which is already some 20 years old, the camera is capturing the musician as she plays the drums. And depending on where she puts her hand, it'll play another note from the drum. And that kind of interface has been embraced by the gaming community, for instance. My daughters love Roller Coaster Tycoon, for instance, but it's not so much different than Second Life or Sims or other massively multiplayer online role-playing games. The idea of skeuomorphism means the sense of making the user interface emulate something that's natural. For instance, the note-taking mechanism on, for instance, the iPad tablet emulates a traditional note-taking paradigm with even perforations and ledger lines, etc. And in some sense, Apple and its designer Johnny Ives have exploited this idea of skeuomorphism as a way of leveraging the Apple user interface into the general population, making it accessible to grandmothers, etc. And on the very short horizon, in probably this calendar year or early next calendar year, you're going to see more and more virtual reality style paradigms, interfaces coming out. There's the Oculus Rift and the Sony Morpheus and the HTC Vive are all head-mounted display kinds of devices that will enable a more virtual reality kind of experience. So my own interest is in spatial sound, is in giving sound a spatial dimension, generalizing stereo. So there's different mechanisms involved in presenting spatial sound. One of them is interaural intensity difference. So if you have a head, there's ipsilateral means the same side, and contralateral means the far side. So if I talk to this subject, you can imagine that my voice is louder in her right ear than in her left ear because the head shadow is occluding the acoustic transmission. There's also a small interaural time difference. My voice reaches the ipsilateral ear sooner than it reaches the contralateral ear because the sound has to travel around the head in order to get to the far side. And there's also frequency-dependent filtering. The pinna, the outside of our ear, is doing a transfer function. It changes the sound depending on which way it faces. So our ears are basically facing forward because humans are predatory. If we were prey, we'd have a more of an omnidirectional sensation. But since we're mostly killing things, our ears are facing forward to attack the whatever we're eating. So there's three things: intraoral time difference, intraoral intensity difference, and the filtering, means speaker frequency-dependent attenuation and amplification of sounds. That is to say, low-frequency sounds and high-frequency sounds have separate changes in the gain and how loud they are, depending upon which direction the source is from the sink. So the source is the sound, and the sink is the listener. And depending on if I'm playing the sound here to here, the subject, the listener, the sink, will hear that because the two ears are filtering the sound differently depending on which direction it's coming from, and then that sensation is fused in our brain to give us the perceived soundscape. And so those three cues are captured by this single diagram showing intraoral time difference is the phase delay between the ipsa and contralateral ears, intraoral intensity difference because of the head shadow, and then the HRTFs, the head-related transfer functions, is the filtering function. So we're interested in compositing a soundscape from several different sets of sources. So in general, we're surrounded by different kinds of stimuli, and we can imagine compositing them together. In this case, the user in the middle is surrounded by sources corresponding to, for instance, the intercom from the office, or the computer, or the telephone, or the radio, or whatever. And when we talk on the phone, we have to have a multi-presence. We're both in the place where we're standing, as well as on the other side of the telephonic line. And in some sense, those two soundscapes are composited, or are added together in order to yield an integrated perception. So probably everybody's familiar with the hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. I call it narrowcasting. So narrowcasting is an analogy to broadcasting. So casting means throwing something out, like you cast a fishing line out into the river. And broad, of course, means spread widely. And in analogy to broadcasting, we've got other words like unicasting, where you send a letter from one person to another, or multicasting, like I'm doing now, where I'm casting my voice from 1 to 30 people. And narrowcasting, where you're taking some media stream, like a voice, or a text stream, or a database, or a word processing file, or it doesn't matter what the data is, bits or bits, and sending it to some limited number of people. In general, we're deluged with information. I don't know about you, but I suffer from information tsunami a lot. You know, tsunami is a tidal wave. It's too much information. If you try to read the email at the same time you're monitoring the Twitch stream and watching the TV and talking on the phone, it's all too much. And probably, like many of you, I over multitask. I'm overcommitted and I have to be in multiple places at once. So what we need is a way of limiting our exposure and also our privacy. So if I want to say something quiet to my wife, I don't want my kids to hear or whatever, and nothing personal, but I don't want you to hear either. So if I'm going to be talking to my wife now, I want to somehow exclude you from that conversation if it's something private or sensitive or whatever. And likewise, if I'm working on something that I need to concentrate on, I also want to block out distracting sources so that they're not interfering. So we have this idea of narrowcasting. I don't know how many of you remember the classic television show Get Smart, featuring Don Adams on the left, and I forget who played the chief. And they had a cone of silence. So they were spies, and when they wanted to talk about something that was sensitive, they would lower this dome over them so that the rival spy couldn't spy on them. And there was always comical things about how they could, the dome silence never worked right, and they tried unicasting, etc. Dilbert is an American cartoon popular among computer hackers. So this is a product I've been developing. I've been developing for the past year, I modified a pair of standard noise cancellation headphones to recognize stupidity and block it before it reaches your ear. With these on, enjoy total bliss that comes from avoiding the chatter of idiots. And the pointy-haired boss says, do they work? And Wally says, what? And the boss says, I said, do they work? And then Wally says, does anybody have any questions? And then finally, Dilbert says to Wally, those are ordinary headphones, aren't they? And Wally says, well, if you act like you can't hear, they're good thing. And not to overdo the Dilbert thing, one more cartoon. Thanks for testing my new invention. If this thing works, it will change forever the way that mothers use the telephone. We've been on the phone for half a minute. The noise should start any minute now. Here it comes. Hey, what are you doing on the phone? Can I eat the cookies? I think my arm is broken. Where's my toy? Wah, 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 wah. And Dilbert says, now press the toddler noise cancellation button. And then Mom says, it's not the noise, but you need to do something about the visuals. So I'm interested in technology that kind of enables that sort of fanciful interface. Like I said, if you think of a source as where the information is coming from. It might be an auditory source like my voice, it might be a graphical source like a video, it might be a data source like a spreadsheet, it doesn't really matter. And then the sink is whatever is absorbing that source. It might be a pair of ears if it's auditory, it might be eyes if it's visual, it might be your brain if it's conceptual. And so we're interested in taking that narrowcasting idea and applying it to these information sources. I'm also doing computer music, so there's a bunch of techniques for generating musical sources on a computer, FM, AEM, granular synthesis, etc., and a bunch of techniques for modeling the transmission of the sources through space. In a room like this, for instance, there's reverberation and reflection and air absorption. If it's colder, the sound is brighter because there's less humidity in the air, and therefore the water isn't absorbing the high frequencies as much. So there's all those kinds of effects that an autorealistic simulation would model. Autorealistic, auto means related to sound, OTO. And then modeling the sync, too, modeling the listener. So there's head position and things like occlusions and obstructions, and that also get composited into that source-to-sync cascade. If you're talking to two friends at the same time, even if they have similar voices, you can use spatial sound to disambiguate that soundscape. For instance, in this case, person C is talking to persons A and B at the same time, but because the earpieces are pressed to opposite sides of C's head, he or she doesn't have any trouble distinguishing A and B because there's a situation awareness where B is on the right and A is on the left, and therefore, even though they might be talking at the same time with similar voices, they can use the direction to demultiplex, to disambiguate that soundscape. So somebody more clever than me said, nature's given man one tongue, but two ears so that we can hear twice as much as we speak. And one more cartoon. With your kind permission, I've taken the liberty of putting Marvin on mute. Maybe a wife at a cocktail party in order to prevent her husband from saying anything embarrassing. We'd like to have such a remote control. I grew up with Star Trek, and it was a big part of my life. When I was a teenager, there was no girls, there was no drugs, but there was lots of television, especially Star Trek. And in Star Trek, they had the transporter. The transporter would take an object and analyze it and break down the atoms into information, transmit the information via whatever the next century's equivalent of the internet would be, and then a replicator on the other end, kind of a 3D printer, would take that information and recreate the object. Sometimes the transporter would break, and the information stream would get sent twice, or would get sent to two different 3D printers, and the object would be twice replicated, would be reinstantiated a multiple number of times. So that gives the idea of multi-presence. Michael talked about syntopia, is the idea of being in more than one place at the same time. And multi-presence is kind of the same idea, what's sometimes called co-presence or co-location. So the idea is that, for instance, this mandala. A mandala, as probably most of you know better than I do, is a Buddhist psychocosmogram, a map of the heavens, or at least some kind of mental idea of the heavens. And in this particular mandala, there's this guy in the red kimono who's in at least 4 or 5 of these sub-scenes. So you can imagine that the Buddha is omnipresent. The Buddha is everywhere, not everywhere, but anywhere. So I'm making a subtle distinction between being literally everywhere and being anywhere that he or she wants to be. So in this case, the Buddha has chosen to be in these 4 or 5 other rooms all at the same time. So maybe he's monitoring the conversations in northeast, south, and west all at once. So this idea has been explored by science fiction and popular culture. There's a Michael Keaton movie, Multiplicity, where kind of like a Sorcerer's Apprentice sort of thing, he had too much work, so he replicated himself so he could be in multiple places at one time, and hilarity ensued. And in the Matrix series, Mr. Smith, played by the actor Hugo Weaving, replicated himself in order to fight the Matrix. If you look at a picture by Braque or Picasso, it's synthetic cubist. In this particular picture by Picasso, you can see a woman with a frontal perspective and a masculine half with a profile perspective. So the camera is at once in front of the subject and also at the side, and they're combining it together. Maybe Picasso was commenting on the androgyny of humans, or maybe he was talking about himself and his girlfriend. I'm not sure exactly, but the point is that the picture combines multiple perspectives simultaneously. And that's what you have to do if you have a multi-present system. So what does this have to do with ethnomusicology? The idea is that we want to listen to multiple songs at once. We want to be able to go into an online environment, kind of like Second Life. So it's all computer generated, so it's mostly computer graphics rather than photorealistic. And it's limited by the technology, but of course that's asymptotic to realistic. And listen to songs. Maybe you want to listen to Ukrainian songs, or Polish songs, or Jewish songs, or what was the other one? Serbian? Croatian, yeah. But if we want to juxtapose them, instead of having to teleport back and forth, hither and yon, to and fro, back and forth, zigging and zagging, we can simply clone our presence, instantiate multiple avatars, avatars being representatives of the human user in the virtual environment, and copy, paste, paste, paste. So we're in multiple places at once, and therefore listening to these multiple soundscapes, kind of like the Buddha in the mandala. So such an idea isn't so foreign or even new. In this case, this cannon has many, many arms for doing things all at once. And the Hydra has many, many heads. And in this case, he says, I keep cutting and pasting and nothing happens because he's oblivious to all the clones popping up behind him. And in this case, God or whatever deity says, I'm sorry, I can't, I have to be everywhere. So this is probably a little intimidating, but it's easier than it looks. What it says is that a sound source is active unless you turn it off, or unless you focus on another sound source to the exclusion of the first one. So it's called predicate calculus. It's a mathematical notation for formalizing the narrowcasting and the multi-presence that I've been talking about. It's a notation for saying that, for instance, in the top version of it, that a particular channel is active unless you turn it off explicitly, like a mute button, or unless you choose to focus on another channel, which would implicitly still the first channel. So say I wanted to listen to only Marcia, and by focusing on her, I'm going to, for instance, exclude Rasika. Or I would normally hear Rasika because in general, in an open environment, the default is to have universal audibility, and any of you could speak now or whatever, and I would be able to hear you. But if I wanted to, for instance, have Rasika be quiet, I could tell him, please be quiet, or I could focus on somebody else and thereby implicitly quiet Rasika. Maybe he would notice me listening to Marcia and not say anything, or maybe we would have some kind of computer mechanism for enforcing that kind of policy. So if you didn't want, for instance, this dummy head to hear something, you could virtually, put muffling over his or her ears to block it off. And if I didn't want her to say anything, I would cover her mouth, etc. So that idea of narrowcasting applies not only to sources in the sense of quieting somebody's mouth, but also deafening their ears. So one way of preventing Rasika from hearing me would be to cover my mouth. But then none of you could hear me either. But if I only wanted him not to be able to hear me, I would cover his ears. And therefore, you know, I could say something rude about Sri Lankans or something like that, and he would never know. So this idea of narrowcasting applies to both ends of the cascade, the transmission from source to sink. I like ethnic jokes. So in Germany, everything is forbidden unless it's explicitly permitted. The Germans are very top-down. In France, everything is permitted unless it's explicitly forbidden. The French are very laissez-faire. And in Russia, everything is forbidden, especially if it's permitted. And in Italy, everything is permitted, especially if it's forbidden. So, massively multiplayer online role-playing games like Second Life or World of Warcraft or Halo, or I don't even know what the young people are playing now, are servers, strong, powerful computers that can host sessions with tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of players coming together at once to play these often martial games, like fighting, like StarCraft is very popular in Korea. And they're inhabited by avatars, representatives of the human user in the virtual environment, often figurative. So the avatar will look like kind of a chunky humanoid, and will have a perspective that is shared with the human user. So the human user, the teenage boy in the coffee shop in Seoul or whatever, is watching his representative in the virtual environment. And that perspective has different kinds of immersive qualities. It might be totally endocentric. The perspective might be inside the avatar's head. You know, when we look out our eyes, our brain is behind our eyes, between our ears, and we can't see much of ourselves. We can sort of see our eyebrows or maybe parts of our nose, but we can't see, for instance, our hair or most of the rest of our body without contorting ourselves. So that's endocentric, centered within oneself. So that's what I think of as a first-person perspective, a very intimate kind of visual perspective. Generalizing that as an egocentric perspective, sometimes called a tethered perspective, where the camera sort of follows the avatar around, like an over-the-shoulder kind of perspective. And that's very popular in games because people like to see themselves, even though the perspective is unnatural. Increasingly, that's becoming popular in real life too, with people having drones that can be programmed to follow them around. So probably very soon, maybe this season or something like that, you'll see people on the ski slopes or something like that, with drones following them around to take kind of displaced selfies. It's like a long selfie stick. And then a third-person perspective would be totally exocentric, a fly on the wall. The camera up there, it's independent of the avatar that's being followed. So if there were a camera, like a security camera, it would take a picture of the whole room, and it doesn't matter if it's you or me, we're captured equally. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Doug Adams talked about a point-of-view gun, where housewives were tired of ending conversations with their husbands by saying, "You just don't get it, do you?" And they could take this gun, it would shoot bullets, it would shoot empathy. And the housewife would shoot their husband, and the husband would finally understand what it's like to be, you know, home with the kids and have to do all the cooking and cleaning and laundry, etc. So that's what we're kind of doing, is we're playing with the idea of fluid perspective and filtering of information streams. So let me do an example that makes some of this more clear. Why isn't that switching? Probably even here in Canada they have karaoke. Oke is a corruption of orchestra, meaning, of course, a collection of instruments. Kara means empty, like karate means empty hand. So karaoke is an empty orchestra in the sense that the emptiness is the spot where the singer can fill in if he or she wants to. So karaoke is useful for demonstrating these kinds of ideas because it has polyphony, that is to say, multiple voices, multiple audio channels playing at once, and they're synchronized, they're in lockstep, of course, but they're separate. So we can turn on the karaoke source here. And in this case now, we're the green guy in the middle, the second from the left, and we're listening to the I hope you can hear the singing coming from your left and the orchestra coming from your right. Is that pretty clear? So if, for instance, we wanted to focus on just the singing, we can do a kind of megaphone sort of thing, where the singer gets a virtual megaphone and thereby is focused upon. So now the red singer has the virtual megaphone and therefore is focused upon, and the white orchestra is implicitly muted. I'm focusing on the singing, so the orchestra knows to be quiet, and the orchestra therefore has a hand that's maybe hard to make out. It's translucent because it's implicit, but it's nonetheless covering up the orchestral source quality. If I focus on the source of the orchestra as well as the singing, then they're both on. So that was using a select or solo. I prefer to use the word select to solo because solo is too closely tied to the Italian word for one. So if I wanted to focus on, if I wanted to block one of those channels, I can just use mute. So there's covering up the orchestra, so we can only hear the singing, and if I cover up the singing, then you can only hear me. All right, so now we're going to copy paste ourselves, cloning. So if somebody says to go fork yourself, they're not necessarily being rude. They might mean that you can have that syntopia, where now we're in the place of the green and also the blue at the same time. So it's an exocentric interface, so we can have this kind of unnatural sensation of being in multiple places at once. And if we hear the music that we listened to before, right now there's an autofocus process going on where the two sources find the nearest sync. They find the best listener to themselves. But if, for instance, the green guy were for whatever reason deafened, then the sources orphaned by the green guy will find another parent, another sync to listen to. So, for instance, the singing had always been in the right ear, but the orchestra shifted from the left ear to the right ear because of that deafening. Can you hear that? And if we want to focus on one of these syncs, we can give that sync virtual ear trumpets. So now the sync is turned on, and we say we only want to hear from that sync. We only want to listen through that particular audio perspective. So that sync is now selected here. So everything is on the right side because we're forcing the compilation of the soundscape to go to the blue listener. Hopefully Rasika is going to do a more impressive demonstration of the system that Michael had mentioned before, but I wanted to give you a taste of everything first. So at a cocktail party, people naturally tend to make a little cliques, little discussion groups about topics of mutual interest. Maybe there's one group talking about health, and another group talking about finances, and another group talking about their kids, whatever. And you want to be in multiple conversation groups at once. I'm interested in politics, and also in off-color stories, and also in kids, and trips abroad, and general gospel. So I'm going to copy my avatar, paste, 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 so I'm in multiple places at once. So we have a whole iconography that describes these kinds of things in a virtual environment, and the system that Rasika is going to describe is more sophisticated than the crude example I showed you, but the idea is the same. Mute, deafen, select, and attend are the attributes for controlling, for describing narrowcasting in these environments. Okay. So getting back to the hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil, you can not only deafen yourself, but you can deafen somebody across, in this case, the internet. And Rasika is going to try to do a live demonstration where we enable our online environment to anybody that has their computer with it. He's going to announce some techniques for connecting to the server that's running our instantiation of the project that Rasika mentioned, involving display of world music in this online groupware environment. Groupware means software for groups, and so it's interactive, real-time, featuring spatialized sound with a narrowcasting interface, and it's allowing as many people as the server will support to go in at once. So there's voice chat, text chat, and also the musical auditioning that hopefully will enable the kind of musical ethnomusicology that Michael described.
Hello, my name is Rasika Ranaweera, and I'm the one who has developed this system. And since you have listened to more theories behind this system, I'm going to focus more on the real system that we made. When we made the system, at the beginning, we had to make a choice, like which framework that we are going to use for this new system. And when we started this project back in 2008, we had these different types of possible virtual reality environments. Some of you may definitely know The Sims. It's a famous multiplayer game, and the avatars look fabulous. It's really fantastic, and there are other really good virtual environments such as Olive, and Second Life is another proprietary environment which is much cooler avatars. But we prefer those cool fantasy type of avatar over Wonderland, a kind of secondary based avatar system, because back then in 2008 it was a kind of a big deal, because Wonderland was open source compared to the other systems were proprietary, and we may have to buy the source code, or we can buy the source code. But on the other hand, Wonderland was open source, so you have to server and client both. And the other good thing about Wonderland was it's written entirely in Java language. So back then in 2008, Java was kind of popular. Even now it's popular. I'm not saying it's not popular now, but back then it was very popular. So we make a decision that we make our system using Wonderland. Wonderland has these basic features like you can connect to a client via the browser, then you download the client, and after that the client will download the resources and caches to your hard drive, and then you can start working with the virtual environment. As previously mentioned, inside the virtual world, your representation is called the avatar. You can move your avatar using arrow keys, you can teleport, and you have place marks, you can select menus. So in that sense, you can move to different places quickly, such as teleportation. And other thing is Wonderland was based on a very good foundation called voice bridge, which was used in Sun Matter system where Java was invented. They had this conferencing software called voice bridge, and first they developed voice bridge, and then they developed the graphics and invented Wonderland. Wonderland was originally called Project Wonderland, and then later Sun was acquired by Oracle. The team had to change their name. Now it's called Open Wonderland. It's open source, and it's maintained by open source community. And there's also a company who is dedicated to help people when they have problems. The most important thing about Wonderland is that we can not only use the system, we can also develop, we can enhance the system, and also we can make plugins, we can add modules. Here's such an example. This Alice is a 3D authoring program where you can drag and drop objects from a built-in gallery, and then you can make simple animation. And what Wonderland people did was you made a beautiful animation using Alice, and then you can just drag and drop this animation to Wonderland. So what is the important behind that is that if you meet Alice, in Alice terminology, we call it a scenario. You make an Alice scenario, then you can maybe enjoy by yourself only because it's desktop virtual reality. But if you use Wonderland, if you drag and drop your animation to Wonderland, many people can connect and interact with your animation. We developed a similar kind of thing. When we started doing this project, initially we had a project called Music in Wonderland. It has this dome kind of an environment where user can go inside and listen to various type of music. First thing that we did was, since Wonderland has evolved, the music Wonderland stopped working. So since the software upgrade, Wonderland has to be, this project has to be redesigned, remodified, rewritten. So, and the first generation of our system, what I did was simply exporting the source code to a newer system. And the basic features of Music in Wonderland was similar to our system. I mean, I made it almost the same like Music in Wonderland. In our second generation, we were thinking of how we can represent different type of data in 3D world, because as Cohen mentioned, in two-dimensional, for example, if you have a graph, you can represent data as a list, but if you do the same thing in the 3D environment, the effect may be not that much satisfying. But we need to have a way to represent our data. We had this huge collection, and we had different type of metadata. So we first thought we would use, for example, time. We should sort our music collection using time. So we stacked the albums, but then we realized some music in our music collection made in, for example, if it's 2008, then there are many albums, but in a different year there are not so many. So we thought this is not a good design, but the collection that we use, folk-based music collection itself gave us an idea, because the folk-based collection that even Eli mentioned earlier has a diverse global coverage. So we, at this time, we thought we can use to represent these albums, this music in a global, like a globe kind of virtual environment. At this time, we have a cylindrical map, and we have placed the albums according to their origins, and the avatars can go closer to the particular album, and they can listen to music. We have some other features also. These tracks can be individually controlled, so you can start, stop, or you can even mute tracks. In the next level, we started standardizing our system. Like many of you are curating music, but I don't know whether there's a standard format when you guys curate, because when I was working with Michael Frishkopf, he had Smithsonian collection in Excel format, and some of you have in a different format. Some of you have your data curated in databases. But this music XML standard, IEEE 1599, is a way to represent our music in layered architecture. It's XML based, so it's human readable as well as it's computer readable. So we integrated this music XML to our system. That means our backend is supported by music XML IEEE 1599 standard. So in that sense, if somebody else uses the same music database that we have, so they can also, we can share our music database, they can use our music database, because we are following the standard. This standard standardization is a quite good idea, but the problem is some of the music that you may curate have all the type of data that we require. For example, many tracks may have like a metadata for like general type of data, like who created this music and what type of instrument included in this track, and of course you have the audio, and sometimes you may have the score notes and other related documents. But Music in Wonderland has some other layers that can represent the real notes. So in that sense, it can, for example, if we create a perfect music XML file, and if we create a reader for that, we can show where in the music which note we are playing, something like that. We can do many type of operations using music XML. In late 2011, we first released this version. In this time, we have improved a lot, because we kept the huge cylindrical world map because we have this music located in different countries, and we introduced this map metadata window, so you can select a track, click on a track, then you can find the metadata related to that track. And also we have some other control buttons here. For example, you can mute a track using this one, and also you can find where this track is originated from in a Google map. And since you can click from far from the track, you can click on the track and then use this arrow key to teleport closer to that track. And also you can go to the Smithsonian website if you click on the browser site. And this one is a representation for the solar function that Professor Cohen talked about. When we have multiple music tracks near to each other, the cacophony can disturb our hearing. So in order to avoid cacophony, we introduce this button. Once we have clicked this button, so we only can hear the selected source. Let me show you a video for that. In this system, you can hear all the music at the same time. You need to go closer to a track in order to hear that. In Wonderland, you can do special type of thing. You can walk on the air and you can fly. When you click on this type of a place mark, you can find the metadata related to that track. And also the right-hand side shows, in this case in a Google map, where this music is actually from. And also we have a kind of a predefined tour that you can attend. So once you click on the tour, you can just relax. Your avatar will be moved to different sections of the system. Now we move on to narrowcasting. So this is one use of narrowcasting. You hear several tracks. See the vocal tracks. You mute it and you don't hear it. voice chat. Wonderland is a collaborative environment, so you can communicate with other people using voice chat or a built-in text chat. We have implemented these narrowcasting features for both text chat and voice chat, and also for listening to music. We also have the simple searching functionality. And you can check history, which music that we have listened before, and then you can click on them and go back to what your preferred music that you listened before. I'm gonna skip this one. This is about multiple things. You can have multiple of yourself in houses. So forking a new avatar is same as forking yourself. So you just click on the download button, then you can log in as a new user. So this is the importance of users. You have two avatars listening to totally different music in totally different regions. And you can use the narrowcasting function to control what you hear. So that's about focusing on land. And these tracks were from Folkless, Smithsonian Folkless Music Collection. So these are the special parts of the system. We can have multiple avatars. The music is placed in different countries. We have teleport buttons. We can have different narrowcasting features. We have maps. We can even buy the tracks if it's provided. And we can change volume. We can also have place marks. And now we move on to the world music in and what we did in this different is that we had this layers in world music in Wonderland. We start at the world layer, and then you have different regions inside the world. You go to a region, then you can have cities. Once you go to a city, you have a district like in real world. In a city, in a district, you can have different buildings, and we place the music inside the buildings. I have a demo video for that also. First, I will say that so you can understand it easily.
So these concepts were developed in conjunction with collaborators Daria and Yana.
Exactly. Yeah. So that Yana made this beautiful buildings. I have a section for that. So later we might visit to that some of the places. In the first layer, you have world maps. Then you click on the map. Then your avatar will be teleported to this region. Then you can walk around, and then you can go inside buildings, and you can hear the music if you are close enough. This music is spatialized, and also it's stereo. check the metadata related to that fact, similar to for pressing Wonderland, and you have maps, and you can select a different track. You can click on these are real content related to this region, and also this is a Jewish church, and in some places you can find different cities, and we also have tours in the music in Wonderland. Wonderland is kind of resource heavy, so you need a better computer to experience it without doing.
Blessed Virgin Mary in Majorca in May. Like everybody went to Mobilizing.
Other than
it's a church service. They just sing. It's like a special service for the Blessed Virgin Mary.
And they had all the girls. When
two nuns came and they lived in the main house.
Videos will not be played inside the Wonderland, but we will be pointing out to, for example, YouTube videos. That's what our plan. And we have different regions other than Cape Breton, Alberta. These are the beautiful buildings made by Anna. Sometimes you can do through the walls. It's not a bug actually. You can enable these features. This is really nice place, and we are gonna visit later. So see how realistic it is. So these were all made by Yara. You can teleport to regions by clicking on the map. When you have place marks inside maps, when you click on the place marks, you go to a different region. And going to an upper layer is also similar, so it might be confusing, but this is what I have for now. And we have playlist and the history. This is a virtual world. You can easily climb. In this case, I'm on top of a building.
How are we doing on time?
Well, it's 5:00 now, but would you like to take some more time?
Well, if people wanted to try a live demonstration, we can enable that.
Yeah.
We started an half hour late, so.
Yep.
Okay, then I have to switch this computer.
So has a laptop is welcome to join in the world. Doesn't work on tablets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. Is this available, can anyone add content to it? Or is it digital, or is it?
It's under development, but in theory, you have the right URL.
No, she's talking about, it's curated, which means that it's read-only.
Okay.
Oh, I think.
Yeah, currently only Yana is making content and other people are contributing with tracks. But there's no way that you can upload your music. We don't have that function now. Oh, that didn't come. Now it's kind of broken. I have this thing like when I start to do a live demonstration, my computer used to crash. That's why I use a different computer for the presentation.
Start up. Photograph.
Maybe now we can take some questions, and if you can, put it up.
See?
You might have questions now?
Any questions?
Just while you were giving your presentation, there, I had a couple of questions. So just to make sure that everybody understands what happened with this is, like, they've been working on Folkways and Wonderland anyway, right? And then they decided to partner with the Diversity Project, diversitycapebreton.ca project. So they created a special Wonderland for this project that you can access through diversitycapebreton.ca. Well, you can't yet, but, right? Now, recordings, material culture, photos, different things that we collected here in Cape Breton for the East and Central European communities and cultures are uploaded into that virtual world that they created, through which Yana created buildings to replicate real buildings here in Cape Breton. So I don't actually know if I made that more clear, excuse me, but does that make sense? Okay.
Like the giant cello that Rasika showed at the end of the video.
Fiddle.
A fiddle, sorry. Sorry. Is actually downtown, right? It's next to the Flavors on the Water restaurant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And inside, when we go to the Flavor on the Water restaurant, you'll see there's that lighthouse inside that glass walled building. The Ukrainian Hall, you're seeing the Ukrainian Hall, looks very, very much like what Yana created, the church, the Polish Village Hall. And it's an interesting thing, like there's all kinds of decisions that went into the design of this. But things like the steel plant silhouette that you saw that was really more one-dimensional doesn't exist physically anymore. But it's a very, it has a palpable presence in these communities anyway. So in a way, right, it's not like, doesn't have the same dimensionality that the buildings that still exist do, but it's got a presence.
Yeah, I'm wondering what kind of user feedback can you get from the kind of interactions that take place?
So Rasika's a graduate student now, and one of the requirements for getting a PhD is to publish in a major journal. And a lot of the journals that we're publishing in related to computer science rather than ethnomusicology insist upon quantitative rigor. So that's the question we're wrestling with as well, is how do you establish a metric? How can we prove that the system is useful or good or efficient or whatever? So until now, we've run subjective tests, typically with 20 students or so like that, and have them do some tasks, find a song or juxtapose two songs or compare and contrast some selections. and then collect some basic statistics about it, how long it takes them to find the song, and then also subjective experience. How much did you enjoy using this system? A so-called Likert scale is a 5-step qualitative evaluation. Didn't like it all, liked a little bit, neutral, liked a lot, etc. So that's how we've been doing it until now. And if you have some better ideas for
I have probably an old person's comment about this. I can really understand Jana's amazing eye and, seeing the details of these buildings and capturing something that for people who really know the city well, they say, yes, I recognize that. That's great. But I wonder, and I guess the way to test this would be to get feedback from people within the community, how people feel about somehow being like cartoons. And I mean, this is an issue that I have with Second Life. It's not an issue with you guys at all. That somehow the world is reduced to something that looks cartoon-like. And since we're concerned often with the ethics of representation in ethnomusicology, I just put it out there as a comment.
First, let me say that in some ways, Jana's models were too good. That they were rich and overloaded our session server. So we had to downsample them in order to make them manageable practically. The other thing is that there's this notion in virtual environments of the uncanny valley, which means that when for instance, the avatar looks too human, people have a very visceral rejection of it. In the ones we're using now, they're more cartoonish, so it hasn't been an issue. But in other environments that are more photorealistic, people don't like to see something that's close but different. So I know that's not really answering your question, but it's about the perception of the avatars rather than the environment.
Also, if I can say something to that, it always strikes me that when you try to represent something that's been disembedded, even if you have a very good photograph, it's never the same, right? It's always a representation. And just a question of what kind of representation you want to make. In the early days of ethnomusicology, everyone did transcriptions. And then, that sort of fell by the wayside. Maybe the way being able to do very accurate drawings fell by the wayside with photography. But it always struck me that there's a value in having control over your representations. For example, in a transcription, you can emphasize the particular features of the music that you want to emphasize, which you don't get with a recording. With a drawing, likewise, whether it's some sort of a cartoonish caricature or whatever, but you can emphasize the bits that you want to emphasize and leave out things that you don't want to emphasize. And that's often useful in scholarship. And so I think what this enables you to do is to sort of focus this business of being able to develop the environment the way you want it to look. It enables you to focus in on the features that you think are important, that you're trying to foreground in your work, much as you would in an ethnography also. You can't give all of the information as possible and leave out other things. And so there's a kind of a plus and minus attached to it, you know what I mean? Yes, it's limited, but then again, you can never represent the whole thing. You can never get that original continuum of the environment from which the sound has been sort of artificially severed. And so this gives you the chance to be very creative and sort of to do what you feel like you want to do as opposed to a camera. I mean, you can still do it with photography, but I think stripping out some of the information is often, ironically or paradoxically, gives you more information.
So we can think of this as a virtual ethnography of the sound space.
Well, like I said, I mean, it's in terms of its research function, I think it has that, power of disseminating something. I mean, what it is it more like a museum? Is it more like a film? It's hard to say. It's an interactive environment. People can go in and interact, so that it becomes a social space for people who are inhabiting it. So it's just something new, and like I said in the beginning, it's supplementary. I'm not trying to suggest that this would replace anything else that we do, but you're right, Bev. I mean, if people felt offended by, there might be issues like that. On the other hand, I imagine that there's always going to be people who reject any given ethnography as being an incomplete. And it's one of the ironies also of our work, in that you're doing this sort of immersive participant observation that gets you down deep into the trenches of whatever's happening. But it also kind of limits the broader view. And so most people end up with a very particular view based on who they worked with and where they were exactly, and then try to use that to represent an entire community or even an entire country. And there's always going to be problems with those sort of representations. So I guess I would say, yes, those issues may be there, but I think that they're probably there pretty much no matter what we do as ethnomusicologists.
The first demonstration that Rasika showed was a globe turned inside out with the musical selections located on, for instance, their place of origin. So it's a little bit like taking what Ely showed and inverting it, because it seemed more satisfying rather than a Superman kind of model where you're flying outside the globe to have the globe envelop the user. But for the next prototype iteration, we set aside that kind of literal model and embraced a more logical abstraction where the buildings corresponded, for instance, to Ukrainian or Polish or Croatian communities. And then the wallpaper, the paintings on the wall of that building corresponded to the musical selections. So it wasn't a literal geographic correspondence, but more of a kind of rearrangement of the music to make it more like a museum kind of experience. Or the buildings that Jana made, suggesting, for instance, Cape Breton architecture, are kind of not superfluous, but in some sense a bonus. They're like eye candy, and the interface would have worked as well, even though it wouldn't have been as attractive without that kind of embellishment.
I think there's some advantages to having the avatar be a cartoon. It might be, now to think of the buildings with their sort of semi-realism as a stage, kind of realism, the kind of thing that you might experience at a festival where you have a building made to look like something, or a set or something like that, rather than really trying to represent the real thing. And perhaps if the representation were explicit about its intentions in that regard, that could be helpful. Also, I'm sure that you will never strip out the information in the sounds. The sounds will not be transformed into little video representations or something like that. So that's captured as rich as possible, I presume.
Yeah.
If there are videos available, that would be very supplemental.
Sure. But then again, I mean, a soundscape is also so complicated because in reality it's one mono track for every point in the space, and nobody captures that. And so you end up choosing a particular way. No, I don't mean the sound of the ventilator, but I mean the sound of us speaking from here, the sound of us speaking from there. So it's a very multidimensional thing. We only use one or two microphones. We say, okay, we got it. But if you try to record a band, obviously it would be nice to have one microphone per musician. Some of us have tried doing that, but it's not so easy. So you make sure it's okay.
In virtual environments, we talk about the sense of presence and immersion. So presence is the sense the subject has of being in a particular place, like a music auditioning space. And immersion is the sense of being embedded in that space. So in a fish tank VR paradigm like this, there isn't that much immersion, but hopefully, if it's well done, you'll get a sense of presence, including, for instance, personalization of the avatars. Rasika didn't show it, but the avatar can be customized to be bald or have a purple shirt or whatever, so that the user feels more of an identification with their self-designated representative.
I want to point out that your use of presence is a very specialized use of the term presence.
Admittedly.
It's a very important term for me, but it means something quite different. Co-presence is a very important term for me, but it means something somewhat different from multi-presence. So I think it's important to note the specialized use of that term. It's very important in the whole history of Western philosophy, the whole idea of presence. This is an interesting way of thinking about presence, but it's designed and used for the virtual environment. Also, just to look back to the notion of the avatar cartoon, I think that also works well because there is a bit of a cartoonish aspect of this kind of tourism that is encouraged here. You're wonderful being in this space with these sounds, but there is a sense that it isn't real, and so the cartoon suggests that stripping down. You will never identify with the avatar as yourself. So I like that.
Maybe what would solve it for me is if there was some examples in this where you could go to a symphony orchestra concert and hear the same thing, so at least there would be not some sense that some cultures in the world are represented like this and some are never represented like this.
Yeah.
That might help.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hoping is that this technology can be repurposed for any application. Right now, we're using it for Marcia's project, and yeah, if there's a symphony orchestra.
Maybe since this is all being recorded, we could repurpose
Yes.
it to represent this concept.
That's right.
We could all do a little cartoon avatar. So we get to choose our own.
It's also rejecting the violence of the line too. There's a gradient. You can have all kinds of smoothing effects and transitions and arbitrarily reconfigurable. So there's not a digital quantization between, for instance, Ukrainian and Polish music. There's all kinds of interpolations possible.
Where are the women? I noticed that this is very sexist.
No, that's
Alice and
I had a quick question just along the same lines of conversation here. I wondered, it seems like there's tremendous didactic potential here. I imagine, people learning how to, I imagine the potential to learn how to be an ethnographer, to be more than just a musical tourist. I don't see that in the way that it's been demonstrated today, in part because there were no social interactions.
right.
And I wonder how you imagine repurposing in such a way that you balance, on one hand, the sort of me-generational elements of this that place the individual sort of at the center and empowered and sort of there are no limits. And then on the other hand, the real experience of doing ethnography where there are limits everywhere you go. You just can't walk into synagogues. You can't, you have to interact with people. You're constantly approaching. You call it the challenge of human relations.
There actually is, like I used to teach lower level anthropology courses, and there I used, there was this DVD with a workbook, virtual ethnography environment that took students through stage by stage development of ethnographic skills because you had to do certain tasks, right? So if you had to answer some question, you actually had to go into the virtual world and you had to approach people to ask these questions, but only in certain ways, and they'd give you, in different coded language or whatever, the information. So yeah, it's a really good
fascinating
point.
to imagine that.
Yes.
Coming together.
Well, that's brilliant.
yeah, we don't pretend that this is the asymptote and we're going to stop after we finish this. This is just a suggestion that other people like you might continue.
Yeah.
To me, it feels very much like you're creating this great platform. It's a great foundation on which, much to your point, would be to allow people, and someone brought this up before, would you be able to add content to these worlds? Would you be able to contribute? To actually create tours, take someone through, lead them through, give them context on the journey while they're walking from place to place. You fill that with content, you fill it with story, so tour guides and other ways of kind of giving meaning to the reason for the place existing, giving those relationships, starting to fill that kind of void that's not just here's the end point, but the context on the way to the end point. That is the song, the story, the music, the sound.
So we were talking before about the idea of layers. They might be conceptual layers or temporal layers or physical layers. And there's the idea of a proximity mind, where when you get close to it, it explodes into information, a signboard or a sound mark or something like that. So you can populate the space with minds that are context sensitive. If a certain person or avatar approaches it and they're interested in a certain genre or era, then the system will contextually or adaptively accommodate such interests.
I think maybe hypertext might be hypertext fiction might be a good way to think about that, because depending on the choices that you make in a particular at a particular point, you get a might be possible if this is envisioned more as a hypertext than as a virtual tour.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, there's ways of turning this into sort of a computer game. Gaming is actually a good paradigm. The problem is there aren't that many educational games out there, as I discovered with my kids. But you could imagine it a kind of a game where you have to try to find something, and it does lead you through a kind of a hyper media, a set of choices, but not an infinite set of choices.
No, it wouldn't be infinite, but it would. Some choices would tell you one part of the story, another choice would tell you another part. And in hypertext fiction, the experiments that were being done 20 years ago and so on, the story actually changed depending on the ordering of what you do. If it was, for example, a mystery story, you might find by following a particular set of clues certain kinds of narrative that emerged, but a different narrative if you followed a different set of clues. So you're getting closer to the ethnographic experience.
And computer games actually implemented that. Those kinds of ideas. That you would make choices and the story would unfold in different ways.
I think a number of people were envisioning this. Years ago, I was talking to Eli about it during the break, and now the technology is available to implement some of those earlier ideas. I had one about a folk festival where there was a front stage and a backstage area, and you could find out some things about all the conflicts that went into the content presenting. At a festival, you would get backstage and so forth. Now it's it's possible to do all of this sort of thing and represent it virtually, but the choices are so interesting because in some areas you want the richness of information, but I think in other areas it's very dangerous to be simulating something which really ought not to be simulated, but ought to be experienced for real.
As the cycles and bandwidth increase, people are going to experience music in a different way. Instead of kind of a audience-performer dichotomy, people will be able to go into the music and, for instance, hover over the shoulder of a fiddle or whatever. And you might even take the strings of a violin and separate them spatially. So it's a kind of hyper-mixing paradigm.
I kind of like the jam session.
Do you have this working now? Oh, sorry.
I just have a question about whether you can incorporate, like, I know there are some real images in there, but instead of like the mock-up of the church or whatever, if you could just have a picture of the church, or if you could choose those layers, or have it looked like you could have like scores if you were interested in the musical score, turn that tab picture on or whatever. Are those things possible?
The original trees that Jana gave us were too rich. They had too many polygons, too many edges, too many vertices to be rendered efficiently. So what Rasika did is he flattened them into two-dimensional things, which works fine if you're looking at it from far away. But if you get close to it, it'll be a little strange to see, a two-dimensional tree. So it's possible, of course, to populate the space with, graphical two-dimensional objects that don't have any depth. But the immersive paradigm will
bring you the same feeling.
Yeah.
But actually, every track has a spot for an image. So if you look, you see this track here, there can be an image for every track. So you can put photographs in the current system. It just isn't part of it.
I'm just trying to think of how you can use the material existing in a database, or like, let's say the diversity Cape-Breton one.
Yeah. Well, the way it originated with Folkways albums was to put the album covers in as the images. But since in this case a lot of the tracks they're not albums, so there's no album cover, but we can choose any other image.
So for you couldn't have video too, so it's all 3D, you can't really.
Well, it's just rendering, the data. So there's no reason to possibly couldn't take the album art and render a video, for instance.
Right.
If iTunes or whatever distributed such media along with audio track.
You want to give us a
Yeah, so I was trying multi-presence. That means having my avatar both. So I have one avatar. I'm Rasika, but I can be Michael and I can be others. So that's one thing that you can do in multi-presence. So if you have Java installed in your computer, you may want to give it a try. Getting this system live, and we can chat. We can do live talk, but for the sake of this virtual world, because this is supposed to be a collaborative environment. We don't have to be physically close to each other. So
Can local IP.
yeah, we give you the IP address. Can you go to 142.112.112.39/8080 port 880 in a browser. This might take a while, so let me show the instructions. Sorry, my computer froze again. I'm terribly sorry.
A live demo.
Yeah, something is wrong always when I do. When I open PowerPoint, then something goes wrong.
only disappointment?
Yeah. I'm really sorry about that.
That's right.
But later this week, we will set up a server here, so maybe you can.
Maybe there's during the week we have a period during a roundtable. Maybe you'd like to join us for that.
Okay.
And if you haven't kind of set up before, then maybe we can take a few minutes to do that. Would that be a good idea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as long as I don't use PowerPoint, maybe I'm okay.
Maybe. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, that concludes